You think you know the story of the Little Mermaid. You see the flash of impossible red hair, the glint of a dingle hopper, the sound of a calypso singing crab. You hear the soaring melody of a young woman wanting to be part of your world. The story you know is a romance, a story of a rebellious teenage girl who falls for a handsome prince, defies her father, makes a bad deal with a fabulous villain, and, after some light peril, wins her man and gets her happily ever after. It is one of the cornerstones of the modern fairy tale canon, a story of transformation and love conquering all obstacles. The story you know is a lie. It is a beautiful, comforting, and wildly successful lie. But it is a lie nonetheless. It is a layer of spun sugar and brightly coloured paint applied over a gaping wound. Because the original story, the one written in 1837 by a deeply troubled Danish man named Hans Christian Andersen, is not a romance, it is a story of body horror. It is a story of self-mutilation, of chronic, unending pain, of social alienation, and profound existential despair. It is a story that does not end with a wedding on a sun-drenched ship. It ends with suicide. It ends with a teenage girl dissolving into sea foam, her body disintegrating into nothingness because the love she sacrificed everything for was never truly returned. This is not a children's story. It is a coded message, a confession etched in the language of fairy tales. To understand it, you have to scrape away the Disney gloss. You have to go back to the source. You have to walk into the cold, damp world of 19th century Copenhagen and meet the man who bled this story onto the page. Once you understand the excruciating pain written into every single sentence, you will realise that the mermaid's journey was never about getting a prince. It was about obtaining a soul. And once you understand the brutal theological landscape of Andersen's time, you'll realise that for the mermaid, this was not a matter of love, but of eternal salvation or damnation. The story you know is a lie, and the truth is so much darker and so much more profound. The first and most jarring contradiction to the modern tale appears the moment you open Andersen's original text. Forget the sanitized bargain with Ursula. The Little Mermaid of 1837 does not trade her voice for legs. She trades her tongue. The sea witch, a figure far more primordial and terrifying than a sequined lounge singer, does not magically bottle her voice. She takes a knife. Andersen wrote, "Then the witch cut off the mermaid's tongue so that she was dumb and could neither sing nor speak." Think about that for a moment. This is not a temporary magical ailment. This is a physical, violent act of mutilation. It is bloody. It is brutal. It is irreversible. The mermaid is not merely silenced. She is maimed. She is rendered incapable of ever telling her story, of explaining her sacrifice, of crying out in pain. She is made a permanent victim, a beautiful, voiceless object. This single gruesome detail shifts the entire narrative from a story of unfortunate bargains to one of deep, physical trauma. But this is only the beginning of her suffering. The transformation itself is not a swirl of glitter and magic, it is agony. The sea witch's potion is described as a sharp, two-edged sword piercing her delicate body. When she wakes up on the shore, human and naked, the pain does not stop. It has just begun. Andersen is unflinchingly clear on this point. Every single step the mermaid takes feels like she's walking on sharp knives. He wrote, "Every step she took was, as the witch had said it would be, as if she were treading on sharp knives, but she bore it willingly." And later, when she dances for the prince, every time her feet touched the ground, it was as if she were treading on sharp-pointed needles and knives. She dances for him, and for the court, spinning and leaping more gracefully than any human ever could. And with every single movement, she is being tortured The very thing that endears her to the prince, her ethereal beauty and grace in motion, is the source of her constant, private agony. He applauds her performance, completely oblivious to the fact that she is figuratively and almost literally bleeding for his entertainment. To understand the sheer horror of this, you have to place yourself in the world before modern medicine. Imagine the world of 1837. This is a time before anesthesia was in common use. Surgery was a waking nightmare of butchery and screams. Pain was an intimate, unavoidable part of life and death. When Andersen wrote of walking on knives, his audience didn't imagine a metaphor. They imagined the real thing. They understood the feeling of steel on flesh, the searing, relentless nature of such a wound. Picture a ship's surgeon in the Napoleonic era, just a few decades before Andersen wrote his tale. A sailor's leg is shattered by cannon fire. There is no morphine, no ether. There is a bottle of rum, a leather strap to bite down on, and several strong men to hold him down. The surgeon takes his saw, a tool not much different from a butcher's, and begins to cut through flesh, muscle, and bone. The man is awake for all of it. He feels every rasp of the saw, every severing of a nerve. His screams would fill the belly of the ship. That is the reality of pain in this era. That is the sensory landscape Andersen is drawing from. The mermaid's pain is not a fairy tale inconvenience. It is a state of being. It is the constant, grinding reality of her new life. She smiles, she serves the prince, she sleeps on a velvet cushion outside his door like a favoured pet, and all the while, her feet are a canvas of unending torment. This is not a story about overcoming an obstacle to get a boy. This is a story about how much agony a person can endure for a love that will never be truly seen or understood. To grasp the chilling depths of Andersen's tale, you must understand the man himself. Hans Christian Andersen was not, as many imagine, a jolly, pipe-smoking collector of folk tales like the Brothers Grimm. He was an author, a creator of new myths, and his life was a raw, open wound of ambition, insecurity, and unrequited love. He was born into abject poverty in Odense, Denmark, the son of a shoemaker and a washerwoman. His world was one of squalor and desperation. From a young age, he was an outsider, gangly, unattractive, and possessed of a desperate, clawing need to be loved and accepted by the very high society that looked down on him. His entire life was a performance. He moved to Copenhagen as a young man, with dreams of becoming an actor or a ballet dancer, but he was clumsy and awkward. He tried to be a singer, but his voice broke. He finally found success as a writer, but he was perpetually thin-skinned, obsessed with reviews, and terrified of losing the favour of the wealthy patrons who supported him. He was the poor boy, with his nose pressed against the glass of the aristocratic ballroom, dreaming of being invited inside. Does this sound familiar? The Little Mermaid is a perfect allegory for Andersen's own social climb. The silent, yearning mermaid, born in a lower world, the sea, gazes up at the world of light and privilege, the land, embodied by the handsome prince. She is willing to endure any pain, to mutilate her own body and identity, to cut out her own tongue, just for a chance to walk among them. She learns their ways, she wears their clothes, she sleeps at their feet, but she is never, ever one of them. The prince in the story is the key to understanding this. He is not the charming, empathetic Eric from the Disney film. Andersen's prince is a figure of casual, thoughtless cruelty. He is fond of the mermaid, certainly. He calls her his dear little foundling and says he loves her as he would love a dear child. He has a velvet cushion made for her so she can sleep outside his bedroom door. He treats her not as a woman or a potential partner, but as a pet. A beautiful, exotic animal who performs for his amusement. He loves her dancing above all else. He makes her dance for him again and again, delighting in her grace, never once suspecting that her performance is an act of self-immolation. He is the ultimate symbol of the privileged class, well-meaning in his own way, but utterly blind to the suffering of those beneath him. He cannot see her pain because he has never known pain. He cannot understand her sacrifice because he has never had to sacrifice anything. Andersen's diaries reveal a life filled with intense, passionate, and ultimately frustrated attachments. He fell deeply in love with several people, both men and women, who could not or would not return his affections in the way he desired. One of the most significant was Edvard Collin, the son of his patron. Andersen's letters to Collin are filled with a desperate, romantic longing. He wrote, "I long for you as for a lovely Calabrian girl. My sentiments for you are those of a woman. The femininity of my nature and our friendship must remain a mystery." Collin, a straight-laced, conventional man, was made deeply uncomfortable by Andersen's emotional intensity. He kept Andersen at a polite distance, refusing to use the intimate form of "you" in their correspondence. In 1836, just a year before The Little Mermaid was published, Edvard Collin announced his engagement to a woman. Andersen was devastated. He wrote to a friend of a love that was never to be. The prince is Edvard Collin, the mermaid is Andersen. The story is a raw, heartbreaking confession of a love that is impossible. A love for someone who sees you as a curious foundling, a plaything, but never as an equal, never as a partner. When the prince ultimately marries a human princess, someone from his own world, someone who can speak his language, someone whose feet do not bleed, it is not just a plot point. It is the reenactment of Andersen's own romantic rejection and social failure. But the story goes even deeper than social commentary or personal heartbreak. To understand the mermaid's ultimate sacrifice, you have to understand the most terrifying concept in Andersen's world, the soulless creature. In the 19th century Danish Lutheran tradition, the possession of an immortal soul was the defining feature of humanity. It was the ticket to an afterlife, to heaven, to eternity with God. Animals, and by extension, mythical creatures like mermaids, did not have souls. When they died, they simply ceased to exist. They dissolved into nothingness, into the cold sea foam. This was the mermaid's primary motivation. The prince was merely the vehicle for her true quest. Her grandmother, the wise old matriarch of the sea, tells her, "We have no immortal soul. We shall never live again. We are like the green seaweed. Once cut down, it never grows again. Human beings, on the contrary, have a soul that lives forever, lives on after the body has turned to dust. The only way for a mermaid to gain a soul is if a human man falls in love with her, loves her more than his own mother and father, and joins his hand with hers in marriage before a priest. Only then can a part of his soul flow into her. This is not a story about getting a man. This is a story about avoiding eternal oblivion. The mermaid is not just lovesick, she is terrified. She is facing a metaphysical ticking clock. She has 300 years of life, a life of beauty and song in the cold, godless depths, and then nothing, utter annihilation. The human world, for all its dangers, holds the promise of eternity. The prince is not just a handsome face, he is her only chance at salvation. This theological terror transforms the story. Every step on knives is not just for love, it is penance. It is a pilgrim's painful journey toward a holy relic, an immortal soul. Her silence is not just a handicap, it is the mark of a martyr. She is trading her entire identity, her body, her voice, her world, not for a fleeting romance, but for a chance to exist beyond the grave. The sea witch is not a villain in this context. She is a force of nature, a transactional dealer in existential bargains. She makes the terms brutally clear. She warns the mermaid of the pain. She warns her of the consequences of failure. The first morning after he marries another, your heart will break and you will become foam on the water. The witch is honest. She is a purveyor of a terrible but clear contract. The true cruelty of the story lies not with the witch who takes the mermaid's tongue, but with the prince who takes her devotion and gives back only condescending affection. Let's return to that prince, that handsome, oblivious man. Anderson paints him with strokes of damning subtlety. When the mermaid first arrives, he is delighted by his new toy. He has clothes made for her, a boy's clothes, a page's costume, so she can ride with him and attend him. She is desexualized, made into a companion, a mascot. She sleeps on a cushion outside his door, a loyal dog waiting for its master. He tells her she will stay with him always. But his words of affection are laced with condescension. He pats her head. He calls her his silent, expressive-eyed pet. He loves her, yes, but in the way a man loves his horse or his hawk. He does not see her as a woman. He does not see the depths of her sacrifice. He sees a beautiful, mute creature who dances for his pleasure. The ultimate proof of his blindness comes when he finds his actual bride. He had been told he must marry a neighbouring princess, but he confides in the mermaid that he will refuse, for he could only ever love the beautiful girl he believes rescued him from the shipwreck. A temple maiden he glimpsed for a moment on the shore. He does not know, and the mermaid cannot tell him, that she was the one who saved his life, dragging him from the waves and leaving him on that very beach. Her greatest act of heroism is credited to another. Of course, when he travels to the neighbouring kingdom, the princess he is meant to marry turns out to be the very same temple maiden. He is overjoyed. "It is you," he cries. "You who saved me when I lay half dead on the shore. Oh, I am too happy." And in that moment, the mermaid's fate is sealed. Anderson writes, "The little mermaid kissed his hand and she felt as if her heart were already broken. The wedding is a festival of light and joy. Music plays, banners fly. The prince and his new bride stand on the deck of the ship, celebrating their love, and the little mermaid is there, holding the bride's train, smiling. She smiles through the agony in her heart, which is now far greater than the agony in her feet. She remembers the sea witch's prophecy. At sunrise, she will dissolve into foam. This is the story's darkest night of the soul. As the celebration rages on, the mermaid stands alone at the ship's rail, staring into the black water. And then she sees them, her sisters. Their beautiful long hair is gone, shorn from their heads. "We have given our hair to the sea witch," they cry, their voices thin and reedy in the wind, "to get help for you, so that you may not die tonight. She has given us a knife. See, it is very sharp. Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the heart of the prince. When his warm blood falls upon your feet, they will grow together again into a fish's tail, and you will be a mermaid once more, and can come down to us in the water and live out your 300 years. Here is the final choice, not between two men, but between murder and self-annihilation. It is a moment of pure, tragic horror. The mermaid takes the knife. The promise is tempting. A return to her home, an end to the pain in her feet, a reprieve from the death sentence of the sunrise. She creeps into the tent on the deck where the prince and his bride are sleeping. She pulls back the curtain. The bride's head is resting on the prince's chest. He murmurs his new wife's name in his sleep. He is dreaming of his happiness. The mermaid looks at him. The man who caused her such torment, who treated her like a pet, who broke her heart without ever even knowing it. She raises the knife. The blade gleams in the moonlight. Her hand trembles, and she cannot do it. She sees the man, not the symbol. She remembers his kindness, however flawed and incomplete it was. In this final moment, her love for him, a love that has been defined by sacrifice and pain, asserts itself one last time. She chooses his life over her own. She kisses his brow, a final, silent farewell. Then she throws the knife into the sea. The water hisses where it falls, and with a last look at the sky, now turning red with the dawn, she throws herself over the rail and into the waves. She does not turn back into a mermaid. She feels her body dissolving. She is becoming foam on the water. This is the end. This is suicide. She has failed in her quest for a soul, failed in her quest for love, and now she is paying the price. Utter non-existence. This is the true, brutal climax of Andersen's story. It is a tragedy of cosmic proportions, a story of a creature who sacrifices everything for a world that will not have her and a love that cannot see her. But Andersen, even Andersen, couldn't quite bear the finality of it. In a move that many critics see as a last-minute failure of nerve, he tacked on a spiritual epilogue. As the mermaid dissolves, she does not cease to be. She feels the warmth of the sun and finds herself transformed not into nothing, but into a daughter of the air. She has become a luminous, ethereal spirit. Other spirits surround her, and they explain that while she did not win an immortal soul through the love of a human, she can now earn one through centuries of good deeds. For every good child she finds, a year is taken from her 300-year trial. For every bad child, a tear falls, and a day is added to her servitude. This ending, while slightly softening the blow of total annihilation, is still profoundly tragic. It replaces the quick, clean death of dissolution with a long, slow purgatory. The mermaid is still trapped between worlds, neither human nor mermaid, her fate now tied to the random whims of children's behaviour. She has escaped oblivion only to be sentenced to an eternity of ethereal community service. It's a consolation prize, a theological loophole that allows Andersen to save his heroine from absolute damnation, but it does not erase the horror of what came before. The physical story ends with a young girl choosing to die rather than commit murder, her body disintegrating in the cold morning sea. Now, let's place this raw, devastating narrative next to the one we all know. The sanitization of The Little Mermaid is one of the most complete and successful acts of narrative laundering in modern history. The primary agent, of course, is the Walt Disney Company. When Disney approached the story in the late 1980s, they were faced with a fundamental problem. Andersen's tale is an anti-romance. It is a story whose entire philosophical weight rests on its tragic conclusion. You cannot simply give it a happy ending without gutting its meaning entirely, and that is precisely what they did. The motive was simple: commerce. The late 20th century, particularly under the Disney brand, demanded stories that were uplifting, romantic, and family-friendly. A story about a girl who mutilates herself, endures constant torture, and then commits suicide was, to put it mildly, not going to sell lunchboxes. So they identified the problematic elements and systematically removed them, replacing them with palatable, marketable alternatives. First, the core motivation. The terrifying existential quest for an immortal soul was too complex, too religious, too dark. It was replaced with a simple, relatable teenage desire. She wants to be where the people are. She wants the boy. Ariel's quest is not for salvation, but for a boyfriend, and this immediately lowers the stakes from eternal life and death to a simple romance. Second, the pain. The central horror of Andersen's story, the constant, agonizing pain of walking, is completely erased. Ariel's transformation is magical and painless. Her legs work perfectly. She stumbles a bit, sure, but it's played for comedy. The idea that her every step is torture is unthinkable in the Disney universe. This single change removes the entire dimension of martyrdom and physical suffering from her character. She is no longer a tortured saint. She is just a girl on a deadline. Third, the voice. The brutal physical cutting of the tongue is replaced with the magical bottling of her singing voice. This is a brilliant and necessary change for a musical. Ariel can still think, she can still communicate through gestures, and most importantly, the audience knows the voice is still there, intact, waiting to be restored. The mutilation is gone, replaced by a temporary magical theft. The stakes are lowered from permanent disability to a recoverable loss. Fourth, the prince. Andersen's casually cruel, condescending prince is transformed into Prince Eric. Eric is kind, heroic, and genuinely interested in Ariel as a person, not a pet. He is actively searching for the girl with the beautiful voice. He is not blind to her, he is simply confused. He is a worthy romantic hero, not an instrument of psychological torture. His love is the prize, not a source of unwitting cruelty. And finally, the ending. The choice between murder and suicide is, of course, completely removed. In its place, Disney creates a spectacular final battle. The sea witch, Ursula, transforms into a giant monster. The prince, not a bystander, becomes the hero. He commandeers a ship and, in a moment of swashbuckling genius, impales the giant Ursula on the splintered prow. The villain is vanquished not by a moral choice, but by physical force. The contract is broken. The king recognizes the power of love, and Ariel is transformed back into a human permanently. She gets the boy, the legs, and the soul, though the soul is never mentioned, without the eternal damnation part. The wedding happens. Everyone lives happily ever after. The sanitization is total. Every single element of Andersen's dark parable is inverted. A story about the pain of being an outsider becomes a story about the success of assimilation. A story about the failure of love becomes a story about love conquering all. A story about a woman's silent suffering becomes a story about a man's heroic action. A story that ends in suicide becomes a story that ends in a wedding. Disney didn't adapt The Little Mermaid. They hollowed it out and built a new, much more profitable story inside its skin. They took a piece of jagged, painful sea glass and polished it until it was a smooth, round, marketable pebble. So why does the original story still hold such power? Why, even after decades of the Disney version, do we find ourselves drawn back to the horror of Andersen's vision? Because the sanitized version tells a lie about the world, and the original tells a terrible truth. The lie is that love is always returned, that sacrifices are always rewarded, that suffering has a purpose, and that every story has a happy ending. The truth of Andersen's tale is that sometimes love is unrequited. Sometimes your sacrifices go unnoticed. Sometimes you can change everything about yourself to fit into a world, and that world will still reject you. Sometimes the person you adore will see you as nothing more than a curiosity, a pet. And sometimes the pain is just pain without reward or redemption. The Little Mermaid is not a fairy tale. It is a crime scene preserved in narrative amber. It is the story of Hans Christian Andersen's own heart, a heart broken by social ambition and forbidden love. He was the mermaid, forever gazing up at a world he could join but never belong to. Edvard Collin and the other objects of his affection were the prince, beautiful and oblivious. The pain of walking on knives was the pain of his own insecurity, his own feeling of being an imposter in the halls of the elite. The loss of her voice was the loss of his own, the inability to speak the truth of his desires in a world that would have condemned him for them. It is a story written in a code of scales and sea foam, a desperate attempt to articulate a pain that had no name in 19th century Denmark. It is a story about queer longing, about social anxiety, about religious terror. It is the story of anyone who has ever felt like an outsider, who has ever loved someone they couldn't have, who has ever felt that their true self had to be hidden or mutilated to survive. The Disney version is a fantasy. It's a lovely, escapist dream. But Anderson's version is real life. It acknowledges the darkness, the pain, the possibility of failure. It tells us that the most profound act of love can sometimes be a silent, solitary sacrifice, a choice made in the dark with no one to applaud. The enduring power of the story is not in its romance, but in its tragedy. We remember the mermaid not because she got the prince, but because she didn't. Her tragedy makes her immortal in a way that a simple, happily ever after never could. She is the patron saint of the broken-hearted, the voiceless, the outsiders. So the next time you see that flash of red hair and hear that song, remember the story beneath the story. Remember the girl with the severed tongue and the bleeding feet. Remember the boy from the slums of Odense who poured all of his loneliness, all of his pain, and all of his hopeless love into a story about a creature from the depths. The Little Mermaid is not a story about a girl who wanted to be human. It is the story of a man who feared he wasn't, and who was willing to walk on knives in his art to convince himself and the world that he had a soul worth saving.